on Seattle's minimum wage. I'll walk through all of that. And you'll get your tests back. Quizzes, all the quizzes. And next Wednesday, you're going to have another quiz. And I'll tell you right now what it's going to consist of. It's going to be 3 questions from this quiz. And you either get 10 points or 0 points. You're not going to get any partial credit on that. And we'll have 3 other questions that are on price ceilings, price floors, international trade, minimum wage. This will allow some of you to redeem yourselves. Okay. Minimum wages. So, minimum wages, as we know them, started in the United States in the 1930s, just as an effort to get out of situations where people were paying some people exorbitantly low wages. And the idea was that it was somehow going to help low-income people. Since we started paying minimum wages of one sort or another, actually since long before that, New Zealand put in a minimum wage in the 1890s. That was the first one in which we actually see the minimum wage. The British, of course, had maximum wages. For hundreds of years, you weren't allowed to pay peasants over a certain amount because they were afraid there would be battles over wage, people switching jobs, so they put that restriction in. So a whole different set of analysis going along with that. But we've had minimum wages in the United States for about 80 years. We've had a federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage today is $7.25. It's binding in any state that does not have a state minimum wage or has a state minimum wage that's lower than the federal minimum wage. And that particular federal minimum wage of $7.25 has been around for more than 10 years. It has no cost of living adjustment associated with it. And a lot of the debate, you even saw it, actually you didn't see it, because you didn't watch. But in the State of the Union address, there was a lot of talk about the minimum wage, and there will continue to be talk about the minimum wage. My guess is we're not going to see passage in this Congress of a change in the federal minimum wage. Find a seat somewhere. What the Obama administration would like to do right now is take the $7.25 minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, and raise it to $10.10. As we see when we go through this, the reason Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell were the first senators to stand up and say, this is a great idea, let's get the federal minimum wage up to $10.10, is because it has almost no effect in the state of Washington. Because as we go through these, let's back up a little bit. So you will see there are 29 states that have state minimum wage laws that are different than the federal minimum wage. And they range, so the minimum wage ranges from, we don't even see what it, so in Georgia, they actually have a $5.15 minimum wage on their books. It's not binding. They have to pay federal wages for it. But in the other states, you can see that the minimum wage varies across states. California, it's going up to $10. In a year, there are some, this I think is Washington, D.C. Yeah, this is Washington, D.C., where they have effective wages going from $10.50 to $11.50 over the next 2 years. Can you guys read that? So if you can't, shout. Washington's minimum wage as of January 15th, I think it was when it changed, went to $9.47. This is the highest minimum wage in the country. So and I'm going through this right now because you need somewhat of a reference point to understand part of what's going on with the $15 minimum wage piece that's in effect. The basic arguments that exist in the minimum wage world are those in favor of minimum wages say one of two things. They say it helps the poor, and it helps the poor more than it hurts the poor, so we're going to go ahead and do this, and job losses are minimal. There are another group of individuals who simply say there's no impact. When you impose minimum wages, you don't lose jobs. And then there's a group on the other side that says, to some degree or other, if you impose minimum wages, so you're imposing what we've already started looking at as a price floor, when you start imposing minimum wages, you start losing jobs. During this debate that was going on last year in Seattle, people were adamant that neoclassical economic theory, the sort of stuff that you're learning now, is just not applicable to this problem anymore. And what you're going to see is it's not that this is not applicable, it's just that in certain circumstances it may not apply. In other words, we have to look at more than just the simple graphs. We have to look at elasticities. We may have to look at threshold prices. There are a lot of things that are going to drive whether minimum wages cause job losses. And part of what I think is going to happen is we're not only going to see job losses, we're going to see changes in the nature of jobs and the hazardous jobs. So, so this first bunch of slides are not mine, but you can sort of get a flavor for what. We should mention that. So on the federal side, we have a minimum rate wage proposal to go up to $10.10. So we're talking about going from $7.25 to $10.10. The thing to keep in mind when you see this in the political realm, and it's really a political question at this point, is that in some states, going from $9.47 to $10.10 will have no effect, or virtually no effect on the labor market. It's just not a big enough change. I mean, you're really talking about 5% or something, ultimately, and those changes are getting closer and closer over time. In other states, where the minimum wage is $7.25, you're seeing a 45 or 50% increase in wages. That's going to have a significant impact. So when you see people from Tennessee and Louisiana and Alabama who are senators arguing against changes in the minimum wage, they're doing it largely from the perspective of, in my state, we have a whole bunch of jobs that are paid $8 an hour, $7.25 an hour, and those jobs are going to, a lot more of those jobs are going to be affected because we have this distribution. And again, in states like Washington and California, we don't care because we have higher minimum wages, or almost as high minimum wages. So some interesting observations before we get into the detail of this. One observation is that higher wages are good for business. Oregon has a minimum wage above neighboring Idaho, and employers in the eastern part of the state are deluged with job seekers. But what's happening is, and what we think will happen in Seattle as well, is when you start getting into local minimum wages, which Oregon and Idaho are in a sense local minimum wages, but when you get more so into minimum wages on the scale of Seattle versus the rest of Western Washington, the impacts are going to be a lot different. And they're going to be a lot different because there are a lot more substitutes for labor in the local environment than there are in a global environment. Same thing here. What's happening in CTAC is there are lots of applications for the $15 an hour minimum wage jobs down there. That's just the Seahawks, or the CTAC area. And we'll come back to this most motivated worker piece. I've been in a taxi cab in Anchorage, Alaska, and a taxi cab in Nashville, Tennessee, and had each taxi cab driver go, "Oh, Seattle, that's where the $15 minimum wage is going. I might want to try to go up there." I mean, people are hearing it, and they're also understanding it's a big difference in wages. So how did I start getting into this? These are the things we look at. Here's a little more history that we pulled up when I first saw this coming up. There's the federal rate of $7.25. You see the current rate in Washington State. It is notable that the minimum wage for H-2A visa workers, these are agricultural workers that are allowed in under a special program, their minimum wage is $12.42. And the way they calculate that minimum wage is they take all the agricultural workers who are working in that particular level job and they take the average of them. And that's the wage you have to pay. So they look at the market to see what's going on. So even in some of our systems, we have minimum wages that are fairly high. That's not just a Washington wage, that's a general wage for agricultural workers. I guess the other thing that's interesting is Seattle's, the one we're going to be looking at is phased into $15 an hour with COLAs on top of that. There's also a Washington State proposal for $12 an hour, which in a lot of ways we'll see maybe more appealing. San Francisco is going to 15. As soon as we get it, San Francisco, we compete. Seattle and San Francisco compete with social programs. So you get quick reactions out of things. So they have this passed. San Francisco's interesting. My guess is that you would you just have trouble finding people making minimum wages in San Francisco. But you also have, it's a very cleansed environment. You don't see poor people or recent immigrants or people like that working in bars or any place downtown. Because the wages are high and they get pushed out, there's no place to live, transportation costs are expensive. It's a different environment. So this may in fact, 1105 may in fact be a non-binding wage in San Francisco. So when this first came up, I saw a newspaper article that said they were proposing $15 an hour. And there's a guy in my office who does all our accounting and he does our payroll and that sort of stuff. And I said, okay, Dave, just do the calculations for me. What does it look like? What does an employer who pays minimum wage today, we did update this, pay? So when I'm saying, what do you pay the employee? What do you pay the state and state taxes? What do you pay in city taxes? And what do you pay in cooperative federal taxes? So employers pay half of Social Security and half of Medicare as well. So for a 40-hour a week, full-time, year-long person, the current cost of employing a minimum wage employee in the state of Washington is $21,800. So the people you see that are in fast food places, if they are getting minimum wage, some of them are not, and aren't getting tips. Or in a lot of places that, these places that sell secondhand CDs or secondhand clothing or whatever, anybody that wants to open, or maybe tattoo parlors. People are getting minimum wages, it's really low. But that's what they're paying people. So this is what an employer now pays. And we're not even gonna look at the phase-in at this point, I'll come back. It's $15 an hour, it's $34,000. Well, $34,371.98. So the response, when you first look at this, is you go, that's a big number. And the people who are supporters of the $15 minimum wage are saying this difference is going to have no impact on employers' decisions to hire people. And what I'm doing today is sort of going through and saying there's a possibility that there are going to be impacts, and you don't have to have very high elasticities for that to occur. I threw this one in here because we are going to see states and areas where people try to double the minimum wage. So you can see the sort of impact it would have if you did that, at least in terms of one person. When you start thinking of somebody who's doing a manufacturing job where they're sewing clothes together. So South Seattle, actually, in SoDo, there are a number of places that actually manufacture clothing. They hire people, an awful lot of them are recent Asian immigrants, and they know how to use sewing machines, and they pay them $12 or $13 an hour. They're sort of borderline profitable, and they're going to be, and some of them are already leaving. They're moving to other areas because they don't want to have to see this sort of wage progression that's going to hit them as they get new rents. So it's a real decision that firms are having to make even now, even though this is being phased in over time. So how did this come about? Well, it came about, there are actually two sides to this. It came about because we had a couple people who were candidates for office who made it an issue, and I think it's a legitimate issue, of saying there's a lot of inequality around here, everywhere, and is there anything we can do about it? And they were approached by union members, SEIU, the Service Workers Employees Union, and they came up with this idea jointly of out of the blue. No one did any studies of whether 15 was good or bad or not. They came up with $15 an hour. But they came up, they were looking at it from the standpoint of how do we increase the wealth and welfare of low-income workers in Seattle? And this is what they came up with. They came up with the $15 an hour piece. The city council, as you may or may not know, passed this through. It did not go to an initiative. And it actually was not challengeable by an initiative after it passed, because there's a special law that says they couldn't do it the first year because it had to be in place for a certain amount of time. It's an interesting legal piece. But the question we're looking at it is, will increasing the minimum wage to $15 per hour increase the disposable income of low-income workers in Seattle? We're going to look at it from the standpoint that if people are getting a minimum wage or might be getting a minimum wage and they keep their jobs, they would be getting increase in wages. One of the articles I gave you on this, though, talks about who actually gets the minimum wage. In reality, the minimum wage doesn't get paid to too many people who are the primary breadwinners in families. It's a small percentage, probably under 20%. Most minimum wage jobs are second jobs in families where kids have them, teenagers have them. So we're not always looking at this low income group. There are a lot of other people out there that are that are impacted by this. And what supporters are saying, and what they think is going to happen, is that incomes will rise. I think that's for people who have jobs that are currently being paid under $15 an hour, and who have those jobs when the wages go up to $15 an hour, it's unambiguous that those jobs will rise. What we're really trying to look at is, are those the same people that are in those jobs today? That's one question. And B, are there the same number of jobs sitting out there? The argument is there are going to be no job losses. And that comes from an interesting history. I think over the last 35 or 40 years, there have probably been 50 studies on minimum wages. 4 or 5 of them are pretty big studies, and they looked at situations where particular groups of people saw minimum wages rise. And in fact, at least in a number of those studies, they did not see significant decreases in jobs that were available. I think and actually, what people concluded from that, and a lot of people have gone on this approach, is that, well, if they raise the minimum wage and you don't see job losses, that means the theory's wrong and we don't have to worry about this minimum wage issue. So when I started talking about this, I was getting emails from people that were on the committees for raising the wage and stuff that were really nasty, like, vulgar and foul, and, sort of, you can't use economics to analyze this, and you guys are nuts, but lots of good words as adjectives and adverbs. But they really believe there'll be no job losses. But I think there's a fairly easy explanation for what we saw in those studies, and we'll come back to it. There's this other argument that I wish were true, that it'll cost business nothing because the increased wages just get poured back into the economy. Most of this income already gets poured back into the economy. This is a lot of small business. It's middle management, or middle class people that go out in these businesses. I think if this were true, if number 3 were true, someone already would have won a Nobel Prize for coming up with this idea. We just haven't seen that happen yet. And of course, there's this idea that Seattle needs to be at the front end of all this. What I conclude going through all of this is that some incomes will rise. I think that's unambiguous. If you're a dishwasher now and you're making $9.47 an hour and they actually need their dishwasher, they need their dishes washed. Too much caffeine. Their incomes will rise. So I think that's unambiguous. And interestingly enough, a lot of the work that was done, the city hired people to go look at the impact of this. And some economists at the University of Washington and Berkeley, and their conclusion was, well, incomes will rise. Well, the 35 of us could have sat down and come to that conclusion in about 10 seconds. If you change the minimum wage, some people's incomes are going to rise. So we didn't get very far with that. I do think it's possible there are going to be large job losses. And as we'll see, I think that's possible simply because the elasticity measures that drive large job loss numbers are not very large. We can have significant job losses without very much elasticity change at all. And that's simply because this is a big wage change. We're not looking at a smaller wage change that we've seen in other studies. And lastly, and we'll spend more time on this in a bit, the lower end of Seattle's job market is going to change. You're going to see far fewer immigrants working. You're going to see far fewer mom and pop stores. You're going to see no summer teenage employment. The less skilled, so the people at the bottom of the labor force who have very little skills, who can come in and sweep the sidewalk and do things like that, they're going to lose their jobs. And the reason they're going to lose their jobs is because some kid from Oberlin College that wants to become an actress and has a degree in acting is going to say, oh, I can come to Seattle and wash dishes or sweep floors for $15 an hour and push my acting career. I'll go apply for that. And the employers are going to find those people attractive. You know, they're going to have people that appeal more to their customers, they can chat with their customers, interact some more, they're easier to get along with, they don't have language barriers, there are all sorts of issues that come up. It's sort of it may be a little strong, but you could argue that this is sort of, you could be facetious and argue that this is part of the cleansing of the Seattle workforce. We're getting rid of all the about it, sort of the undesirable lowering of the workforce by doing this. Let's see how is moving along. Okay, you guys are now experts at this, so we can plunge through this really fast. This would be a normal open market for unskilled labor. That's basically what we're looking for. We're looking at in a minimum wage scenario. You've got a prevailing wage rate, W star, and a quantity of workers being hired and working with Q star. Keep in mind, I said specifically, this is an open market. In fact, what we don't have this in Seattle. What do we have? We have the highest, we already have a minimum wage that's the highest minimum wage in the country. So we're already in a position where we have some effects of a price floor in place. We're sort of ignoring them at this point. But there is some evidence it was gotten from a study that the Hotel and Restaurant Association did. They did a survey. And the number of people who work in restaurants per table in Washington State, or however they calculate these things, is almost 10% lower than what you find in other states that have lower minimum wage laws. In the state of Washington, you're not allowed to count tips as part of minimum wages, as you do as this program goes, you do for a couple of years. But what that means is that the restaurateurs are paying much higher wages and have a much higher wage load to have a restaurant or a group of restaurants in Seattle than they might in some other state. So we already know that there's an impact there. There are gains from trade, as some of you got. Gains from trade are the consumer surplus and the producer surplus that exists in the trading environment. Keep in mind that in this particular model, the demanders are the businesses. Those are the restaurateurs and the factories and those sorts of people. The suppliers are the actual laborers. They're supplying their own labor and they own their labor. So here's minimum wages as a price floor. And again, we should be starting from this. In Seattle, if we're really going to do this analysis carefully, we should be starting from this point and moving up this minimum wage line higher. Right? We're trying to keep it simple. So on the right side, you have a non-binding minimum wage. In other words, if you have a minimum wage that's below the prevailing wage rate, it has no impact. So until about a month ago, maybe it's still true, but in North Dakota for the last 4 or 5 years, they had a $7.25 minimum wage. No one was being paid $7.25. They were being paid $15 or $20 for jobs that 10 years earlier were paying minimum wage. And that's because there was huge demand for labor, including unskilled labor in North Dakota. But you can have this non-binding minimum wage, and it's important to note, and this is what I think has been very much missed. We can do this. So what am I showing here? This is the classic price floor diagram that I put up the other day in class. But when you put in a minimum wage, you have demand for labor at QD, the supply of labor is QS, and what do you have? You have surplus. Because more people want to work than employers are willing to hire So that's typically what we get when we put a price up, or price floor. So I can start off and say, okay, this is, I'm guessing here, Alabama. Probably a good guess. Okay, the minimum wage in Alabama, or excuse me, let's just say the prevailing wage in Alabama is $7.25. Okay. If you put in a minimum wage of $10.25, you at least theoretically have the potential for a pretty large surplus of labor, a large unemployed group. So all of these people would be unemployed. These people used to be working, those are job losses. And these are people who are attracted to Alabama because they now have a high wage rate. So this is job loss. This is new entrants. And of course, you're keeping this in place with a higher wage. Everybody with me so far? So what if you go ahead and say, let's look at Washington State. Then we do this. Let's just if we assume that we're at that equilibrium now, and now you add a minimum wage on of $10.25, how big is the impact? It's much smaller. And it's much smaller because the difference between an equilibrium wage and the wage that's being imposed on them is much smaller. And I think what we see in a lot of the studies that we've seen done is this impact's relatively small because the wage difference is relatively small. Or in cases where they're looking at wage changes, the minimum wage doesn't change over time. So the federal minimum wage hasn't been indexed in forever. But wages are slowly creeping up with inflation rates, so it catches up. So these differences get smaller and smaller over time. So it's the fact that they're really close together, the minimum wage is $10.25. It means the impact may be small, and it may be so small that it's not really measurable. Firms may just not bother laying people off. It's 50 cents difference. But it's an important thing to understand because what's driving certainly the federal differences and what we're going to see significantly in localities in the state of Washington is that difference between what the current wage rate is and the future wage rate with the minimum wage is large. And that leads us to believe we may have larger changes in the labor force. This is what I basically just went through. You have the minimum wage. QS is, the QD is the number of workers hired. Q star was the old equilibrium, and QS is the number of workers that actually want jobs. So if you're trying to take notes, you have this paper on campus, so you can see all this stuff. So what happens in the marketplace? You just have the standard changes in trade, and you have a dead weight loss, where the yellow part is dead weight loss of minimum wages. Again, if this minimum wage change is pretty small, that dead weight loss is tiny. If it's large, maybe have a larger impact. So it may be, and I am in this school of thought, increasing the minimum wage a certain amount is a good thing. We ought to be doing it. It ought to be indexed. The fact that we haven't done it has caused some of the problems we have across the country. My argument here is not that we shouldn't increase the minimum wage. It's that by increasing it to $15, we've probably created a set of problems that we don't want, and probably had some negative effects as well. So the initial effects of minimum wage is above the market wage, loss of jobs for some workers, gain in income for workers who keep jobs, loss of return profits for particular business firms, and I'll talk about some specifics of that later. Higher unemployment, simply because you have people entering, some people are losing jobs, and you have people entering. The taxi cab driver from Anchorage and the one from Tennessee are looking for jobs. They're considered unemployed. They're here. We're going to attract workers. You're going to have dead weight loss, so you're going to have less output. And my guess is that ultimately you're going to have migration out of the city. It's going to be higher wages are going to be reflected in higher real estate prices, higher rental costs. If you don't have any, if you just got here from Thailand and you don't have any English skills, and you can't, and you're trying to find a job in Seattle, you need to be able to provide the employer $15 worth of work. That's a hell of a lot harder to find in Seattle than going to Bellevue or Kent or someplace else where you can get a job for $10 an hour. It'd be nice to get the $15 an hour one, but the competition for those $15 an hour jobs is going to be fierce. So those people, these lower skilled individuals who have not developed skills yet or don't have them yet because they just got here, are going to have to find a lot harder time getting jobs. And they're going to leave the city. And this is what I mean by sort of the nature of Seattle is going to, it's probably already started to change, but it's going to change a lot more because of this. It's going to become whiter, more yuppie-ish, more educated. Some of those things sound good, but the diversity disappears, and we're harming people in the process. So here's where the real question comes in here, and we may not have clear answers to this. How many jobs we actually lose in Seattle is going to depend on the elasticity of demand for low-income or low-wage labor. We don't know exactly what that elasticity is. I'll show you some estimates of what it might be later on. Generally, low-wage labor is considered relatively inelastic, but it certainly doesn't have zero elasticity. And it may be that there are, it's quite possible, I think, that there are threshold elasticities. In other words, if you have a minimum wage of $9.47 and you increase the minimum wage to $10.25, you don't lose any jobs in Seattle. It has zero impact. So that's one elasticity. It's basically saying you have perfectly inelastic demand, at least really close to that wage rate. But it may be that if you push it up to $12 an hour, then you lose 5% of your jobs. Or if you go to $15, you lose 10% of your jobs. In other words, it's plausible that elasticity changes as you're moving up that price line. Those are hard, you have to go estimate them. And the fact of the matter is, from an economist standpoint, what's going on in Seattle right now is one of the great social experiments. I just hope we can get the data. It will be fun to look at. It has a lot of, there are all sorts of bad things, but no one's ever tried anything like this. And we should have the data to actually see what happens over time. But all these changes that might happen depend on elasticity. And at least in recent studies, when you're looking at these small relative changes, the elasticity seems to be pretty low. So just going back to what we see in this marketplace. At an hourly rate of $9.47, the gross payroll for the employee is $16.41, and there are taxes withheld. So these are Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes and some income taxes. If you don't have kids, You don't get an income credit, and you do pay some income taxes. So this idea that the poor don't pay income taxes is a fallacy. If you have 1 or 2 kids and you're on minimum wage or 15, 18 bucks an hour, you should not be paying taxes because there are programs that get you around. But if you don't have kids, you don't have that luxury. So those programs don't apply to you. And as we'll come back to that, there are suggestions of getting rid of that. So your monthly take home is $1,377, and your annual take down is $16,500. If you go to the $15 an hour, you can see why people like this if they think they can keep their job. All of a sudden, they're going from $16,000 a year, $16,500 a year, to $25,500 a year. It's a good thing. I do think it's disingenuous for us to be going out there and telling people, everybody that's out there now, that your income is going to go up to $25,525 if we don't know how many people are going to lose their jobs and how much job turnover there's going to be. Because a lot of people that have those jobs now may not have them 5 years from now. The employer sees this. The employer sees a monthly gross payroll of $1,600, $2,600 in the $15 case. They pay the taxes. You'll see the monthly tax totals that they're actually paying. The total expense goes up drastically, goes up $1,000 a month, $1,500 a month, or $15 an hour. And the actual cost to the employer, this is important, is $16.52. And that's because they pay $1.52 in extra taxes that don't get pulled out of the employer. This is important because I'm going to come back with some alternative suggestions on how we might take care of the equity problem that we're always dealing with here. So we went and got data from the Employment Security Department on in the state of Washington. Employers have to file on a quarterly basis for each employee how many hours they worked and what they were paid in total. So you can get an approximation of what people are getting paid on an hourly basis. It's not perfect, but it's the only data we have out there. And actually, relative to most data out there, it's pretty good. We weren't able to get it city specific. We had to take state data and draw it back into the city because they don't have zip codes. Actually, they do. The data is such that you can tell where the employer's home base is. So Starbucks files all its records from Soda, their headquarters downtown. But those people may be working in Spokane. We're not able to tell that. So that's one of the problems you get with this. It's fixable if you wanted to actually collect the data set, but that's not happening yet. What you can see is that different industries are affected differently by this. If you go to public administration, so if you go to government, you'll see that there's very few entities that are impacted by this because governments pay high wages. They have very few low-income people out there. And the total impact on them is relatively small. But if you look at the food services industry, this is anybody that waits tables. So anybody, a bartender, a waiter, a waitress, most of the people that work in the back of the house are paid under $15 an hour. And even though a lot of them make tips, they're going to be affected by this. The restaurateurs are going to have to pay for this. There'll be some use of tips in the beginning in terms of calculating minimum wage, but it's a big number. This is an annual amount, $72 million for the city of Seattle. For a lot of these restaurateurs and hotels, it's coming right off the top. So if you start, and we're not going to have any sympathy for these people, but if you look at Ethan Stoll and Tom Douglas and Linda Duchang, and they own 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 restaurants. And they make tons of money on them. They're going to get $2 or $3 million a piece just pulled out of their profits and distributed to their bartenders and waitresses. And in some cases, the people in the back room, but less impact. it is interesting. I talked to all these people, and I talked to a lot of the waiters and waitresses, especially the bartenders. The bartenders are terrified. Some of the bartenders in these places make $50 an hour, 4 nights a week. I mean, they do fantastically well. They're afraid people are going to start tipping because in 2018, 2017, they're going to be getting paid $18 an hour. And if you're getting paid $18 an hour, people are going to go, do I really have to tip this way? So they were not really totally pleased by this. The people in the restaurant business who have been suffering with all this are mostly people in the back of the house. So again, people who are unskilled, less, quote, presentable, not sharing in tips in most places. They're going to benefit from this in a big way. But a lot of this is going to people that are already making a lot of money. And the state of Washington is just one of these states that they're not going to include tips in this in the long run. So this is the big affected area. If you go down to general services captures a lot of people. Construction, of course, does. There's a lot of labor there. The weird one is here. You look at healthcare and you go, how can there be 3,494 employers of minimum wage employees in the city of Seattle? Well, it's because the feds have a program. It's a health aid program that there's a special Medicare fund that pays for healthcare workers to go in, instead of having people having to go into nursing homes or that sort of thing, they have healthcare workers go into their homes. And they pay them low wages. They don't pay them minimum wages, but they pay them under $15 an hour. In order to get that money, you have to register, the family, the home has to register as an employer. So what we're seeing here is that we're going to have a lot of people impacted by this. And until the feds come up with a way to get more money into the state of Washington, what we're going to see is just fewer hours of health care if we have to go ahead and pay this. And there, it causes all sorts of odd problems. I'll come back to it. Where's retail? Here's retail. The retail and the hotel trades take a big hit, $89 million. A lot of this is everybody from the mom and pop store with one employee to REI and Macy's and everybody else, Starbucks. These have interesting problems in and of themselves. I mean, they already have, because they're $9.47 an hour, they've changed the way they pay a lot of people. And then there are a lot of retail places went on commission basis. In clothing stores, they had to get away from that because they got sued under wage and hour laws. So this industry has all sorts of problems. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So you can see it runs the gamut. It's expensive. It's $383 million a year. And as you'll see later in the course, I'll just give you this example so you know how much $383 million is. How much do you think it would take in King County to provide free buses instead of everybody paying any fares? In other words, just take the fare box out of all the buses that currently exist in King County. Anybody know? $300 million a year. And that's because 3/4 of it's already paid for with grants and federal money and all this other stuff.
What's the transportation fee we get, like from my car registration? They charge us a $20 transportation fee, which probably.
Yeah, a lot of that's going into digging tunnels, things like that. Yeah, there is a King County tax on that. And but what I'm talking about is just getting rid of the fare box. How much more money do we need? Those taxes can go away. But I'm going to go argue at some point, they shouldn't go away. Just give people free buses. And that's the solution to a lot of issues. But what you see is, this is a hell of a lot of money. And this is under the assumption that we don't lose jobs. Even if we lose jobs, there's still going to be dead weight losses that are associated with all this. This is just looking at how are different sorts of firms affected. Half of those small firms, of course, are healthcare workers, or health workers in the category we were looking at before. So this is spread across the population. Large employees are certainly bearing the larger brunt of it in terms of total cost. And again, you can say you don't care about that, but the implications, the broader implications are you look at this, an increase to $15 an hour is about a 60% increase in wages. Almost every study that we looked at, I think with the exception of one that I think is El Paso, maybe wrong on that, someplace down there, showed minimum wages that were less than 50% of the median wage. This $50 wage is going to be someplace in the neighborhood of 65% of Seattle's median wage. In other words, you might be able to increase minimum wages at some point and have a small impact, but no one has ever tried this. I mean, we're looking at bumping up way into the labor market. And if you might be sitting out there going, man, that would be okay, I'd like to make that kind of money. The problem is, sooner or later, the response is going to be fewer jobs. Yeah.
But I'm just saying, like, when they do increase it to $15, can't major, like, businesses, substitute with, like, they do employee transportation, like, taking that kind of, away, including that with the wage, like, they provide employee meals, some provide.
There's a lot, all that stuff's going to come into play. So those are the sorts of adjustments that will occur. What we'll see is, let me just get to this and then we'll come back to that. Here are three. I don't know what the elasticity is. And I don't think anybody does at this particular level. We're not going to know for 4 years. But these are low elasticity numbers. I mean, a minus 0.1 is tiny. It says for a 1% increase, you have a point in price, you have a 0.1% decrease in quantity. That's a tiny elasticity. And 0.40 is very inelastic. So even under these scenarios, the job losses are relatively large. It's hard for me to believe that given the size of this price change, that we're not going to have job losses somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 jobs. We are also going to see, and this is an important thing to note, we're not just looking at job losses in what you're thinking of as, they're going to get, instead of bringing 2 people in, they're only going to bring 1 person in. They're going to bring 2 people in and they're going to work 6 hours instead of 8 hours. And job intensity is going to change. So we're really looking, what we're probably looking at is changes in hours, changes in benefits. And there'll be all sorts of other odd distortions. The people from, I gave this talk last week at one of the alumni groups, and one of the people that was there was the VP of HR for REI. And they have 7 stores in Washington outside of Seattle proper. So they're already getting, and they pay people $12.50 an hour. They pay medical care for anybody that works over 20 hours a week. So they're already way under what other firms do, or way better than what other firms do. They give their employees, the big benefit. Anybody work at REI? The big benefit is the discount. My daughter worked there for a month. I spent more money than I worked there for the 5 years before that. They give all these benefits, and she said, we're getting pressure from all these places in the other stores that are saying, either we want you to change this, or can we start applying for transfers into Seattle? So this is having ripple effects of the sort you would expect. People from outside the city are going to start to want to see something. And some of that may be good in the sense that we're going to have pressure on wages everywhere. And we do need to see increases in wages at the bottom. Again, I just think there's a certain group of people, and none of us are in that group. But uneducated, unemployed, new immigrants, uneducatable, all that stuff, they're gonna have harder times finding jobs. And in 5 or 10 years, Seattle is gonna look like a totally different place. It's gonna be, how many of you read Brave New World? It's a Brave New World sort of phenomenon, where you're gonna have one group of people like Seattleites labor force, they'll all look like Amazon employees. And then you'll have everybody else outside that world. Nature of job losses. Firms will close down, some will never form. If you're thinking of buying a franchise, fast food franchise, you're not thinking of putting it in Seattle anymore. And you're not thinking of putting a mom and pop shop in, and you're not selling used CDs. It's not going to be worth it to do it. You're not going to do small manufacturing. And a couple manufacturing firms have already left. They're renegotiating leases that go out 5 years. So you have to sign a lease for 5 years, and they're saying there's no use in staying. You might as well leave now. So we're starting to see that. We do get it sounds like I'm being an ogre, just against this sort of thing. I think there are ways that you can do this, but I also think that if you create a bad business climate, or you're perceived to have a bad business climate, you're going to impact the number of people employed and the nature of your workforce. And I don't think that's healthy. So I think, for instance, I think medical leave, so Seattle has earned medical leave up to 40 hours a week, or a month, a year, 40 hours a year now. So if you're sick, you can take time off, you're supposed to get paid for it. And Obama is going to try to push that through on the federal level. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes. Maybe in your lifetime. But I think those things are good things. But they create, when you do these certain things on local levels, you create odd distortions in the marketplace. And that's what a lot of this is being driven by. It's the fact that you have a local community doing this, where the surrounding communities, Bellevue thinks this Seattle minimum wage is the greatest darn thing in the world. They already have 2 new restaurants that are planned there. They're planning on opening in Seattle. They decided to open them over on the east side. So if you're outside of Seattle and you don't have this minimum wage pressure, you think this stuff is great. But that's because the impacts are to push employers elsewhere. Many firms will cut hours, they'll cut marginal jobs. Anything that's tiny is gone. Nonprofits, universities, governments are just going to end up paying higher wages. They'll cut back on jobs as well. And I think over time, what we're going to see is less skilled employees will be replaced by more skilled, better English speaking, better educated, quote, more presentable workers. I think that's going to happen. We don't have the most diverse workforce in the world now, but it's going to get less diverse as time goes on. What?
Maybe we need like wider,
Weird.
everything sounds terrible. I don't get why. I don't get why they
Well, I actually think someone got on the ballot right now, today, a proposal for the city of Seattle of a $12 minimum wage. Instead of this, it would pass by 80%. Because I think everybody is a little skeptical of $15 an hour. It's just too big a jump. And I think people understand that, but it was a political push by the mayor. They managed to get it through. Our city council all voted. We only need one city council member. They all vote. Just give it to one city council member, 9 votes, and we don't have to pay them all $140,000 a year. They all vote the same way all the time anyway. Yes?
If we did go toward the $15 minimum wage, how would it affect like the housing market and costs?
Well, there is a pretty strong argument, I think that's true, that as these wages go up, they're going to be absorbed in higher costs, especially rentals. I mean, rentals are already off the scale. So some of that's going to be sucked up. But, you know, rentals are going up without this being added into it.
One thing we're looking into right now, the rent control.
And rent control's already out there, it's in the media, it's being discussed. And now that's gonna cause another set of distortions. Again, some people gain, some people lose, but the distortions are out there. I've already said most of this. You know, part of this comes from my Jesuit upbringing. So the Jesuits pounded into me that we were supposed to look at the marginalized people. So from my perspective, that's the part of the, we may be helping one set of people, but there's a set of marginalized people that are going to get a lot more marginalized in the next 10 years in this town. So what are the alternatives? So, as I said to you at one time in class, if you're going to go ahead and look at arguments against public policy, you better be looking at the problem to see if there are alternative policies that can help solve the problem. The most obvious ones, we can increase wages to low-income people by 10% immediately by getting away with Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, and income taxes for low-income people. Why we have them on there, God only knows. But if you want to look at why inequality has grown worse over the last 30 or 40 years in the United States, it's because those taxes are capped. Wealthy people don't have those percentages keep taking off, and low-income people really get pounded by it. It's a big chunk of income when you take 15% of their income, or 10% of their income. Getting rid of those taxes makes sense. Expand earned income credits to all workers, even those without children. This is not saying, you know, just go give everybody welfare. It's saying if you work and you're out there trying to earn money, you get some benefit of out there and getting started and being in a low-income job, and you get some credit for that. And you just don't pay, you don't pay the taxes you might otherwise pay. These two probably go neck and neck. And they're out there, I mean, there are bills in Congress that float around by both sides of the aisle trying to talk about this. It's just, it comes back to being an inoperative Congress at this point in time. The other thing is to simply start providing businesses with low-income subsidies. In other words, pay businesses to hire low-income people. Give them tax breaks. So if you can't get the Republicans to do it on one side, get them to do it on the other side. It has the same impact. What we're trying to do is help a certain group of people. And these policies would be complicated. You would have to graduate them. You know, as you got closer to medium wage, they would start to disappear. It provides different sorts of incentives, but it can be done. You do these at the federal level, and to some extent at the state level with a few of the taxes, but not many. You could certainly do it in California at the state level because the income taxes in California are a big chunk, the state income taxes. At the local level, you know, you have two things that suck up people's incomes when they make $25,000 a year. It's housing is 30% of what they spend money on, and the housing is terrible. And the other is transportation. You and the people at the University of Washington and the people that work for King County and everybody else that's sort of in middle class positions can get some sort of subsidized transportation worker card. If you work for King County, you get free worker cards. You know, you travel all the buses free, you can travel the Sounders free, you can go to Gresham Island for free, etc. If you're poor, you can't get that. You're not in those positions. You're doing landscaping on an hourly basis out of Lowe's. You know, and you're 20% of your income might be going to transportation costs. So trying to figure out ways to subsidize free transit is another local incentive, and there may be others out there. But what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to do this on a local level, do something that has direct effects on people's incomes. I think that's it. Questions, comments?
East side's gonna have it bad though, about 405, about they're trying to pull that where it can be up to $10, depending on congestion and traffic.
The bridge already has that
Yeah.
movable I'm always curious when I go across, am I paying $1.87 or am I paying $3.43, depending on what the traffic's like.
I just saw them putting all the new ones up in Boston, all the way up in Linwood now, all the new scanners and stuff.
And the next time you're probably not on the highway during rush hours, but on I-5, if you're going north and south on I-5, traffic is totally stopped, and there are no buses. I mean, it's all single passenger occupancy vehicles. And this sounds harsh, but what we should do is, one lane for single occupancy vehicles and the other lanes are for multiple occupancy vehicles. And it would change, people would change their behavior. It's not gonna happen unless we get the Murphy to do that. Pricing's one way to do it. Just make it more difficult. More questions or comments? Okay, let's take a 2-minute break and then we'll give you your test back.
It might have to come somewhere. There are minimum wage is more of an indirect way of taking business profits that's why it's getting traction.
I mean, trying to figure out the budget for Arrowville City budget. They decided to jump straight into Peter, they're a pretty small basically our parts.
One thing is that
that is so fun. Well, the original
majority of their costs are much more urgent. Not the profits are growing, most of the time they're elsewhere.
oh, you will see. Well, I know.
You're taking this surplus
Totally not. We have a 2-minute break.
work, like.
I know, right? Talking about.
Yeah, there was like, I'll do that one.
Yeah, there was that one problem.
Just technical names.
Not bad.
So there was an analysis. I wrote
Yeah, it's on 6 line.
No, it's complicated. I guess so, yeah. But did you do it?
Yeah, that's it.
How was it?
I think we're okay.
Shut up.
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so she's
Girl, tall, short.
Just played his, news.
It'll be fine. Well, I'm sure things will go well.
They had so many.
Where'd you apply for? The night, the good ones. Yeah, everyone wants those.
What's his favorite?
Good question.
So those guys are from Tacoma, because there's gonna be an initiative in Tacoma, it's gonna go on the city council. So they're curious about what this should as well. Be interesting, huh? It was just telling me, and then he wants back. That's okay, yeah. It was telling me they've done statewide polls. If you put a statewide initiative to raise it to 15, it fails abysmally. Like you only get 10 or 15% of the vote. If you put out an initiative anywhere in the state for $12 minimum wage, it passes with a super majority. So you get 65 or 75% of the vote on that one. So maybe that's where we're headed. We're headed to a state initiative with $12 an hour.
So it's almost trying to do?
Well, that's what these guys are Chamber of Commerce, that's what they want. They want to, they're asking whether, should we introduce our own $12 an hour? And I think somebody should do it in Seattle if they're worried about the chaos this is going to cause. Okay. So these ranged from, there were 110 points. They ranged from 27 to either 96 or 98. So you just, I have to be honest, you're incredibly sloppy. This stuff needs to be precise. And I mean, the first question is, what's the difference between quantity demanded and demand? I would say half of you weren't even close. I mean, and we went over it about 40 times. Quantity demanded is quantity of goods demanded at a particular price on the demand curve. Demand is the whole demand curve. That's all you need. And some of you wrote books that could get their own minimum prices on that issue. So, okay, I'm going to give these back. We don't have time to go through the whole thing right now. We will start Friday by going through this. And I'm repeating myself here. We're going to go through this in careful detail. You're going to have 3 of these questions on your exam, your test, your quiz on Wednesday. And it's either 0 points or 10 points. You either have it perfect or you get a 0. The other 3 questions, you can get partial points. Everybody clear on that? Okay, you can just grab this and leave it, because we're not going anywhere. Tiffany, you have time?